Good afternoon, everybody. I appreciate, or the Pueblo Santa Ana appreciates you guys giving us the opportunity to talk about tribal lands and the work that's going on the Pueblo Santa Ana. I was realizing as Nick was talking, I weighted most of my stuff. The stuff that I'm going to show you is going to be mostly data collection stuff and mostly wildlife stuff, and hardly any livestock related stuff, although everything we do is a balance between wildlife and livestock, and so anything that's benefiting wildlife is also benefiting livestock. So and then we put this on here. I thought I would introduce you guys for those folks who aren't from New Mexico, don't have an idea where we're at. So Albuquerque is right below us there, from the Pointer, Santa Fe over there. The Pueblo's lands, there are two property bases, the property on the east, Tomaya, and the property in the west, Kikinipu. And that's a recent addition that the tribe just purchased in 2015. And that is historical lands that the tribe has a cultural tie to, and you'll see that in the next slide. But the Pueblo lands are on the eastern edge of the Great Basin Desert, and it's semi-desert habitat, 8.5 inches, 8.56 inches of rain per year, so pretty light rainfall. Jemez River runs down through the southwest center, Rio Grande River through the eastern portion of the Tomaya property. So this is information from the tribe's oral history, and it was part of a book that a gentleman produced about the Pueblo Santa Ana Tomaya people. But it shows this generations of travel migration, and I like this slide because it not only shows travel routes and historical places where the tribal members lived, but it also gives you an idea of the amount of land people needed to survive in the Southwest. It's a pretty arid and unforgiving landscape that can really challenge people, and I think being able to move like the Pueblo Santa Ana folks did, and I'm sure a lot of other tribal members did. And this is Atleta where Nick is, and this is over generations of movement right here, and this is all oral history stuff that these guys put together to get here, and then Socorro all the way down here. So pretty big migration pattern. The Tomaya land, like I said, Jemez River, 6 or 7 miles of riparian corridor there. Mesa top here on the eastern side, that's a basaltic volcanic mesa. Foothills, juniper, grassland foothills, grassland, juniper woodland up on the top. This is the Tomaya property, or the Kikinipu property that the tribe purchased in 2015. And this area down here in the corner was where their tribal oral history put them for some period of time, and then there are archaeological ruins that show that there were people living there at that time. Just a typical juniper woodland, grassland, shrubland on the Pueblo riparian area. This is that Jemez River corridor, cottonwood trees looking at the Sandia Mountains to the east. So the Pueblo's primary goals are to create an ecosystem that's going to be resilient enough to withstand the threats that are facing everybody right now in terms of upcoming climate change and just increasing population, et cetera, et cetera. I don't need to go through all that for you folks, and I won't read all those off. They're pretty basic. So this one, everybody's facing this, historic and continued overgrazing. So the property on the left is the Pueblo's property, and this is a grazed pasture that's being managed. And the stuff on the right is a neighboring entities pasture that I don't have to tell you, it's not being managed very well. I don't see much in the way of grass, a little bit down here. And the rest of it's snakeweed and juniper trees. So not much there in terms of forage for either wildlife or livestock. And then the impacts of climate change. And for some folks, that's going to be too much rain and or warming temperatures. And in our case, it's, you know, primarily drought and the impacts of drought that Pueblo's facing due to the location of the Pueblo's lands in the Southwest. And so how does the tribe deal with this? You know, they need to make management decisions based on data collection, and in terms of making informed decisions, collecting a lot of data and using that to help you drive your decision making is key for us. So this is a project that was started back in 1999, and then 3 years of data collection on these long-term data plots, or these long-term vegetation plots, data plots that are 146 of these located scattered across the Pueblo. And on these, they collected data on plant species diversity, plant cover, et cetera, and then in the late 2000s, early 2010s, we collected data on pounds per acre of forage at each one of these plots to inform our grazing decision making, as well as the one that I think that people will often forget about is the photopoint data, ongoing photopoint data collected at each one of these plots, and then data on soil loss or soil gain that could possibly happen. So erosion bridges put in at each one of these long-term plots. And we'll just jump right into it. So if you're unfamiliar with an erosion bridge, you're essentially measuring a soil profile across the landscape. And at each one of those long-term vegetation plots, there was four of these erosion bridge setups were put in. And here's one. And so these 3 bars are the permanent markers in the ground, and then this post or this bar, and then these aluminum bars are then placed in there to measure that. And so the take-home message is for each one of these plots, you have 4 of those erosion bridges. That data gets averaged, and then across this set of data, these 28 plots that were put in 2021, you can track from 2001 to 2019, the difference between what was there in 2001 and then 2019. And you can see that overall, this I think is the more telling thing, is that overall the change in soil, the difference between those averages in 2001 and 2019 barely moved, which is exactly what we're looking for. So it sort of tells me that a lot of our management plans that we have in place right now are working to keep soil in the ground and keep it from moving around too much. And then another thing that we collect on the Pueblo that I think is really important is our precipitation data. And at this point, we have 24 rain gauges scattered across the Pueblo to try to capture the variability that is the Southwest in terms of precipitation patterns. And then at 12 of those places where we have rain gauges, we have weather stations that we put in. And so this graph looks a little messy, but it's pretty straightforward if I can just talk you through it. So the 0 is the average precipitation, and that comes from a rain gauge set out of Bernalillo, which is a town just south of us, and that was 1924 to 1982. And then so anything above that is above average, and anything below average. I think the take-home message from this is 7 years of drought over the last 21 years. So not great track record at this point for the Southwest in terms of precipitation patterns. And these are pretty dramatic drought events or years. and you can see it on the landscape when you're there. But, you know, one of the things that I was really interested in is looking at, so if you're looking at this data, it gives you a pretty good sense of what happens from year to year. But if you're interested in what's happening within a year across the Pueblo, we started looking at this data using isocline maps that our GIS department puts together for us. And so you can see, and I purposely chose 2019 and 2021 because they were dramatically different, and it gives you a better sense of the kind of variability that we experience here in the Southwest in terms of precipitation patterns. And you can see from year to year that precipitation value is pretty dramatic, but within the same year and across the Pueblo itself, you can see a pretty dramatic difference from 8.5 to, you know, almost half of that. So the weather station data has been pretty important. We just put these in 2019. We're looking at ambient air temperature, soil moisture, wind direction, wind speed, humidity, dew point. And what we're trying to get at, some of the things we're trying to get at are what kind of precipitation patterns do you need in order to influence the vegetation on the ground? And vegetation's influenced by soil moisture. And so those soil moisture probes, you know, there are two of them on here, one, and they're both out 6 feet going the opposite directions. One's buried at 2 inches, one's buried at 8 inches. So we get a really good sense of how much precipitation is falling and what that is, how that's going to affect the soil moisture column. And you can see it in this slide. And so this is precipitation. This is in the same area, rain gauge, and then the soil moisture probes. And you can see that it takes a pretty dramatic amount of precipitation, in this case, rainfall followed by some snowpack, to move these soil moisture probes. So the blue is the 2-inch probe, and you can see that moves pretty easily when you get some precipitation. But this probe that's buried at 8 inches, it takes, and that's the brown line right here, it's a little bit harder to see, but it takes some significant amount of moisture in the soil to penetrate down 8 inches to get to that, to push that up. And then all through 2020 and over to 2001 or 2021, we didn't get enough precipitation to really move that at all, and even into the winter of 2021. And this was a harsh drought period for the plants in this area where these gauges are. And you could see that in that plant community. It was pretty dramatic. And this is the kind of data I was really interested in getting, is this correlation between precipitation patterns and soil moisture. And then jump right into photopoint monitoring. Really important. I think people overlook this all the time. So this is a long-term veg plot, 1999. This is an area that had been grazed pretty heavily. The Jemez River is right behind us here, less than a quarter of a mile. So this is going to get grazed pretty heavily. And this is following the removal of cattle from this area. You can see an increase in our annual vegetation. So forbs, some shrubs are starting to come in, some annual grasses. But this is what you really want, is this perennial grass cover, shrub cover, this deep rooted stuff that's going to hold the soil moisture and then hold soils in place. So another project that we have on the Pueblo is the Savannah Restoration Project, which is essentially restoring former grasslands with scattered juniper. And in this case, you can see this is an aerial photo taken during an aerial survey for wildlife, that you got a bunch of little junipers coming in to this grassland, and effectively they've shifted this grassland to a juniper woodland. And that's what we're trying to restore back to, is this former juniper savanna, where it's grassland with scattered juniper in it. So these are a 1935 photo, and then a more recent satellite imagery, then you can see not much juniper in here. Mostly, this is all grassland in here, a little bit of juniper. And by 1998, it's all been converted into juniper woodland. We have a group of guys that goes out, they thin by hand with chainsaws. They do that. We do this to reduce the impact of heavy machinery on the soils, and then it allows the guys to create a ecosystem, or that savannah, recreate that savannah juniper habitat that was there prior to the incursion of those juniper into those grassland communities. Keep your eye on that cactus. And so this is a pre-cut photo on one of the sites. I'm going to go back so you guys can see again. Left a lot of juniper in that drainage. Wildlife projects and habitat management on the Pueblo. We do a lot of wildlife stuff and habitat stuff. One of the things that was really big is in 2005, the tribe implemented a wildlife code. And then these are yearly surveys that the tribe does, where we get up in an air or a helicopter, fly looking for wildlife, count everything you see. And you can see here's 2005, you know, before 2005, wildlife populations were almost non-existent. And then, you know, by 2009, they really responded to that wildlife code, and that wildlife code just put into place some hunting restrictions and a moratorium on hunting until 2011. And now we have draw hunts for Pueblo members. Another thing that's been huge for wildlife on the Pueblo is the set-aside area and corridor area. So riparians, the riparian areas are all set aside for wildlife. And then this big corridor area up here. And then we have the grazed areas. So about 65 to 70% of the Pueblo is grazed, and 35, you know, roughly 35% has been set aside for wildlife. And you will see in the next slide that, so this is data collected on GPS collars on elk, and it's pretty obvious. I'll go back, you can see that. So this is that corridor coming down through here, down into here, and then you go to that next photo where you have that GPS data. And I'm going to jump back up here and just show that this, although this is part of the grazing group, the guys that graze up there have agreed to not graze it, and they haven't grazed it for a good, I don't know, 10 years, which has been good for the wildlife, and the elk really like that area. And you can see grazed area, grazed area, grazed area. You know, the elk respond to these ungrazed areas. Not against grazing, but, you know, the data kind of carries out that the elk prefer to be in an area where cattle aren't. But in this case, I know that's not always the case across the landscape. So historically, turkeys were native to the Rio Grande, and there was within the tribe's traditional groups, there was a lot of interest in bringing back turkeys onto the landscape. And so we worked with the Mescalero Apaches and captured turkeys on their land, or sorry, Hickory Apaches, and then brought down those turkeys to the Pueblo, released them 2004 through 2006. And the population's doing, it's stabilized, it's doing really well. And then another really culturally significant species for the Pueblo that was absent from the landscape were pronghorn antelope. So the tribe did 3 different captures with the Arizona Game and Fish, where we assisted the Arizona Game and Fish in their captures and movement of antelope from areas that were where they were causing problems, and then brought them down to the Pueblo and released them. And those populations that we've released onto the Pueblo have been doing pretty good. This population appears to be doing better than this one. This one seems to be a little bit, this is the lowland foothills area, and it seems to be, This population seems to be struggling a little bit. There's a mountain lion in the area that appears to have decided that hunting pronghorn is a lucrative business. So until that lion moves on, I think this population is going to continue to struggle. There's a group of pronghorn up on the mesa. One of the other really important things that the tribe has done to assist wildlife is to put in a bunch of water sources and drinkers across the landscape. And this is one of the, they call them elko guzzlers, and it is supposed to capture water. And in order to assist the amount of water that this drinker captures, we put these aprons on to capture more water. And for the most part, with the precip that we get between this apron and this is like 9-10 feet long, 6 feet wide, and holds 1,700 gallons of water. With the most part, for this apron and this apron, they stay full enough all year for the wildlife. And they are used really heavily by wildlife. And they're really nice to put into areas where there's a where there's no access to a well or any other kind of water source. So these are some pronghorn at one of our wildlife bird drinkers coming off of a well, a little bear, a lion with her 2 cubs, another little young lion at one of our rubber tire troughs for wildlife, and then some elk at a wildlife pond that we have. And this is a fun, I just like this video because it's kind of fun. These guys are getting frisky.
Thanks, Dan. Like that, Bear. We got about 5 minutes for questions. Is there anybody want to add?
And I apologize, I was rushing through that stuff because I knew I had a lot to get through in a short period of time, so I can answer any questions.
There's a lot of things. I mean, I wish you could continue on. That was a lot of good stuff.
There's a lot, yeah. There's a lot I missed, so.
I think there's a lot, especially for the tribe. I was interested with the, I guess the wildlife code and how that was taken by the tribe. So like here in Isleta, we have issues with a lot of hunting, and like I really like to pheasant hunt and upland hunt, but we don't have a lot of birds. And when I was younger, I remember them being all over the place. Now, I mean, it's like almost out of season year-round hunting. How did the tribe react to something like that?
You know, it was a really, you know, it took, you know, it was that data that Glenn, my supervisor, Glenn Harper, collected through those aerial surveys, where he was able to take that to tribal council and say, look, here are your numbers. And if you're happy with those numbers, then I'm fine with that. But if you want to increase your numbers, you're going to have to implement some, you're going to have to implement a wildlife code that restricts hunting, like you were saying. So it's not year-round hunting. So there's a decrease in, you know, it's like, and it like that data was pretty, to me, it's been, you know, it's just really dramatic. It's like, if you got the code in place and then they put that moratorium in place for 5 years, you know, the numbers went right up, and it was really supported by enough tribal members that it really made a big difference.
Got a question in the chat asking, are you collecting any phenoface data on native or desirable plant species in conjunction with your weather stations?
You know, we're not. And I think, you know, that's been a big question Glenn and I have been kicking around. And I think, you know, one of the, like, we're trying to figure out like what is going to be the best way to match that weather station data with the plant data. And, you know, one of the thoughts that we had was, you know, maybe let's put up a camera that takes a picture at that weather station, to take a picture every day. So you've got a year-long record of plant growth, and then you could stitch those together to, you know, I don't know if anybody's got any ideas. We're still trying to kick something around that's going to be the most meaningful, and it's going to work, you know, like it's going to collect data that's going to be helpful for us, because part of what we're interested in doing is being able to show what's occurring on the ground. And I think, you know, the photos could do it, but you could also collect data. You could also collect veg data. That's an idea. If that answers the question, but.
There any other questions? Someone raise their hand just to make sure I can see some hands. Yeah, that did answer the question. So, oh, Crystal.
I had a question about the drinkers that you have, and you said, you know, they weren't attached to wells. So I wondered, are they hooked up to like a water system, connected water system, or are they like cistern systems? If you could elaborate a little more, that'd be great.
Okay, so the images that I showed of wildlife, Adam, I didn't show any with the drinker. So there are those guzzlers, that very first picture that I showed with the water lines. The guzzlers are not connected to anything, and they just collect water that's falling, or whatever precipitation that's falling. And the other ones are connected to wells that have been drilled, and those wells then have poly pipeline running off of them. And those go, you know, I think there's 23 miles of poly pipeline running across the Pueblo right now, connecting drinkers and rubber tire troughs and steel rim troughs. But in places where we don't have wells, we put in the guzzlers, and we have 5 guzzlers on the Pueblo of Tomaya right now. And out at the Kikinipu property, we have 9 guzzlers, and that's been huge because we're really limited out there with respect to the wells that we have out there. And that's been like the wildlife use of those guzzlers is huge. If you have places that you can't get a well in, and you know that you're not going to have issues with, you know, feral animals like cattle or horses hitting those, because a horse or a cow can knock those down pretty quickly versus an elk or a deer or an antelope. Does that answer your question, Crystal?
Yes, thank you.
And we have one more question, Brad, but to keep with time, we're going to go, Brad, you can ask that question in the chat.